generation, long, long ago, when I was young, there was this song, "Love is a many-splendored thing." That's where I got my title from, Eurocentrism, a many-layered thing. This talk cuts two ways. On the one hand, it proposes to offer a comprehensive summary and critique of Eurocentrism, and it is at the same time a word of warning against a facile rejection, an all too easy kind of superficial dismissiveness. What is Eurocentrism? What could be a useful, succinct definition? It is the European gaze turned towards non-European space, or I should say, turned both towards itself, the self, and also turned towards external space, that is to say, the other or others. In other words, as it has evolved over the last 5 centuries of Europe's rise and ascendancy over the rest of the world, it is a summary, but a layer upon layer kind of very complex summary, an encapsulation, a conglomerate of European attitudes towards the rest of the world, towards the rest of humanity. It is easy to say this, but it is not so easy to fathom just how complex and how a very strong and solid edifice it has become over the last few hundreds of years. How to change it, how to substitute for this intellectual edifice a new and comprehensively satisfactory syntax of knowledge, a new and different grammar of knowledge that might achieve something like a comparable degree of universal acceptance and credibility is the most difficult question of all. What are the various manifestations of Eurocentrism? It is a virtually inexhaustible subject. I'll just try to touch upon a few. When we come to the humanities and the social sciences, for example, it is important to remember, to realize that as the social sciences were being constructed in the 18th and the early 19th centuries, European elites really did know very little about the rest of the world. So, when the new science of economics was emerging, there was little knowledge, if any, of what the Chinese economy was like, or what the Indian economy was like, or what the Ottoman economy was like. When history, which had existed for a very long time, since the days of Herodotus and Thucydides, was being redefined and resystematized as an academic discipline, again, there was very little in it in terms of knowledge of the histories of non-European societies. Basically, what European elites knew was the history of only Europe. And with regard to sociology, it was the same. European thinkers, the founders of the modern discipline of sociology, knew very little about the inner structures and human behavior patterns of Chinese society, or Indian society, or various African societies, or various Islamic societies spread all over the Middle East, and so on and so forth. So what they did was, they took what they themselves knew and they built it into a new social science of economics, a new social science of sociology, philosophy, political science, and so on and so forth. So from the beginning, there was a tendency for the rest of the world to be marginalized in terms of knowledge. New categories of social and intellectual thinking were built around, were based on, not a comprehensive and therefore also comparative knowledge of all these other cultures and societies, but just what was peculiar to Europe. A further level was, of course, a developing sense of superiority versus inferiority. In actual real terms, Europe, or what would come to be called the West, was in military and political terms, and then also in economic and commercial terms, rising above the rest of the world, and a horizontal world was increasingly becoming a hierarchical world of unequal power relationships. And the emerging reality of these power relationships led leading European thinkers, maybe not all of them, but a significant number of them, to postulate that this relationship of superiority and inferiority had been there from the outset. That is to say, it was an essentialistic matter. Europe was, from the beginning somehow, in terms of the human essence that it represented, it had been superior to the rest of the world, and the non-European peoples had been inferior from the start, again in terms of the human essence that they represented, and that is why this unequal power relationship had arisen, not the other way around. Yet a step further, gradually there was created a postulate of the normal and the abnormal. You could say right or wrong, or what was the norm and what were deviations from the norm. Western elites came to perceive their own historical trajectory, with eventually capitalism coming out of, capitalist modernity coming out of the European Middle Ages, and going through a phase of commercial capitalism in the early modern era, and then industrial capitalism in the modern era. They came to see that trajectory as the single possible pathway of progress, and if other continents or other peoples or other societies had not been traveling down that path, that meant that there must be something wrong with them, something wrong preventing them from transitioning, for example, from a traditional to a modern economy, or from a feudal type of agrarian society to a modern industrial society. They must have been held back by various factors that were wrong with them from the beginning. This has led to a 1-0 series of binary oppositions that still prevail to this day. We in the West, the story goes, we had individualism versus what prevailed in the East or the Orient, that is to say collectivism. We had private enterprise and private property. They had state property. We had a state of law, limited monarchy, whereas they had absolute autocracy or despotism. We had the beginnings of democracy even in the Middle Ages, in urban spaces, whereas there no such immunities or relatively free spaces existed. Eventually, we were able to develop history as progress, whereas all these other societies, they have had a past, but they have not had history. They have had a past that does not consist of progress, but only of stagnation and repetition. Western humanity is active, the Orient is passive. The West is dynamic, the Orient is lazy, slothful. The West is invasive in a good sense, and the Orient has always been passive and receptive. Masculine versus feminine. Having a Protestant kind of work ethic versus the absence of any kind of work ethic. Virile versus effeminate. All these binary 1-0 oppositions were postulated as constituting the essential difference between Western civilization and all others. But beyond all this, there is a much deeper, much more profound kind of problem. Because of what I said earlier about the 18th and 19th century construction of the humanities and the social sciences, what has happened is, at that crucial birth or formation moment, there arose a certain structure of knowledge, a certain edifice of knowledge, which has proved extremely difficult to change. You try to escape it, and if your efforts are shallow or superficial, you fall in other traps. Let me give you an example. For example, in economics, the idea of the Homo economicus, the purely rational individual who makes choices about consumption and production, which is the fundamental starting point of modern microeconomics, is, as I've said, a human construct created without any reference to what was at the time non-capitalist world, the non-capitalist world, or non-market economies on other continents. Philosophy, there is a continuous tradition of Western philosophy, but it seems that at some point, the various Islamic or Indian or Chinese or other traditions of philosophy are cut off, and they are not made a part of the history of philosophy. I can speak relatively more securely about my own discipline, history. Somewhere along the line, in the 19th century, European historians create their version of and their own categories about the history of Europe. For example, they create something called feudalism and something called serfdom to describe basic institutions of the Middle Ages in Europe. As they are creating these categories of feudalism or serfdom, they do not take into consideration, they do not even pose the question of whether there might be anything similar in the Seljuk Empire or the Ottoman Empire or in Byzantium or Japan or China. They are not aware, for example, that while there is a fief system in Europe, there is a roughly comparable Timar system in the Ottoman Empire. In the European Middle Ages, peasants called serfs are doing the basic production, while in the Ottoman Empire or China or India, these being also agrarian peasant societies, there are perhaps comparable categories that should also be taken into account. None of this. There is created a category of feudalism, and in opposition to it, there are created other categories. Remember all those 1-0 binary oppositions that I spoke about. There are created other classifications for non-Europe, for non-Western space. Concepts like Oriental despotism, or what Marx called the Asiatic mode of production. It seems that, and this is a binary, this becomes the most important binary opposition of all. Here in Europe, there is feudalism, and it creates capitalism from within its womb. And there in the East, there is the Asiatic mode of production. It does not give rise to dynamic progress. It does not give rise to capitalism, but instead it gives rise to stagnation and repetition, or blockage. It is crucial to understand that these two categories are both constructs of Eurocentrism. Not just one, but also the other. They are their mirror images, so to speak. If you are not in this, you must be in that. And this brings me to a fundamental confusion in Turkish debates about this question, about the nature of the Ottoman Empire. That took place in the 1960s and 70s. There arose a sub-school of historical thinking in Turkey, which argued that to say that the Ottoman Empire is feudal is Eurocentric, because you are fitting the Ottoman Empire into a category established for European history. Therefore, in order to evade Eurocentrism, we must be able to argue that it belonged with the Asiatic mode of production. It was a totally false illusion, because, as I've tried to say, this was the ultimate trap. This was like imported and internalized Eurocentrism to end up classifying yourself as the stagnant and repetitive other of dynamic European development. What I'm trying to say is this. There are these layers and layers of Eurocentrism and Orientalism that have been embedded in the inner structure of the various social sciences over time. And in order to be able to cope with them, in order to be able to critique them, and in order to be able to substitute something else for them, you must work very hard, and you must have a profound inside-outside knowledge of your own field and your own discipline. It is not easy to be an Edward Said. Thank you.